No one told me I was no longer needed. There was no argument, no goodbye, no moment where someone looked at me and said, "We don't need you anymore." It happened quietly. One day, I realized no one was waiting for my answer. I was still there, still breathing, still waking up every morning. But somehow, life had learned how to move without me. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself, they're just busy. They've got things under control now. This is what peace looks like. But peace doesn't feel like this. Peace doesn't make you feel like you're standing in a room where everyone else has already left. I remember the exact moment it hit me. We were all sitting together. Nothing was wrong. No one was fighting. No one was upset. They were talking, laughing, making decisions. And no one looked at me. Not once. I waited. I thought, they'll ask me. They always do. But they didn't. The conversation ended. The decision was made. Life moved forward. And I was still sitting there with words that were never needed. That's when I felt it. Not anger, not sadness. Something colder. Uselessness. It's a strange feeling, realizing that the world doesn't need your voice anymore. Not because you're wrong, not because you failed, but because things work just fine without you. I didn't lose my place all at once. It slipped away slowly. At first, they stopped asking for advice. Then, they stopped updating me. Then, they stopped explaining. And eventually, they stopped noticing whether I was there or not. What hurt wasn't being excluded. What hurt was realizing I could disappear from the room and nothing would change. I used to matter, not in a dramatic way, not in a hero way. I mattered because when something went wrong, people turned to me. What should we do? Can you handle this? What do you think? Those questions used to define me. They gave my days shape. They gave my exhaustion meaning. Now, my days are quieter. Too quiet. No one calls. No one interrupts. No one depends on me. From the outside, it looks like relief. But inside, it feels like erasure. I started noticing how careful people were around me. They didn't argue with me anymore. They didn't disagree. They smiled. They nodded. They moved on. At first, I thought, they're respecting me. But respect doesn't feel like this either. Respect doesn't make you feel invisible. Invisible is when your presence doesn't change the outcome. Invisible is when silence follows you, not because people are angry, but because they've already adjusted to life without you. I caught myself doing something I never used to do. I waited to be needed. I lingered in doorways. I stayed longer than necessary. I offered help that no one asked for, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted proof. Proof that I still belonged. Proof that my existence wasn't optional. And every time no one took the offer, something inside me shrank. Just a little. Enough to notice. I didn't tell anyone how much it hurt. How do you explain pain like this? You can't say, "I'm lonely," because you're surrounded by people. You can't say, "I feel useless," because no one actually said you were. This kind of pain doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from irrelevance. And that makes it harder to fight. I began questioning myself in quiet moments. Was I always this unnecessary? Or did time quietly replace me? Did I lose something? Or did the world simply outgrow me? There's a special kind of shame in this realization. Because nothing is technically wrong. Your life is stable. Your relationships are intact. You're still included, just not needed. And once that thought enters your mind, it doesn't leave. It follows you into small moments. When you speak, and no one responds. When plans are made, and no one asks if you're okay with them. When decisions happen, and you find out afterward. You start measuring your worth by the silence around you. I didn't become useless overnight. I became unnecessary. And that hurts more, because uselessness can be fixed. See, but being unnecessary means the world has already moved on. That night, I sat alone longer than usual, not because I was sad, but because I didn't know where I was supposed to go anymore. When you're needed, your place is clear. When you're not, you start floating. And floating feels dangerously close to disappearing. I realized something then, something I wasn't ready to admit. I wasn't afraid of getting older. I was afraid of fading quietly while everyone else kept living. Afraid that one day, my absence would feel exactly the same as my presence. And once that fear takes hold, it changes how you see everything. It makes you question your past, your purpose, your value. And this was only the beginning, because once you start wondering whether anyone needs you, like you can't stop asking what you were ever worth in the first place. There was a time when I mattered so much that people couldn't move forward without me. Not because I demanded it, not because I forced my way in. They came to me because they trusted me. Because when things fell apart, I was the one who stayed calm. I didn't realize how powerful that felt back then. I thought it was normal. I thought this was just what life was supposed to be. People called, people asked, people waited. If something broke, they didn't panic. They looked for me. I remember the weight of those moments, the late nights, the pressure, the responsibility. I was tired, yes, but I was needed, and being needed gives exhaustion a purpose. Back then, my days had structure. I woke up knowing someone would rely on me. Someone would need my judgment, my decision, my presence. I didn't always enjoy it. Sometimes I wished for quiet, for space, for less expectation, but I never questioned my value. My value was obvious. It showed up in small things. A pause in conversation, waiting for me to speak. A glance across the room, asking without words, "What do you think?" I mattered without having to prove it, and I didn't know how rare that feeling was. I thought it would last forever. I built my identity around it, without realizing what I was doing. I wasn't just a person anymore. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who could handle things. When others hesitated, I stepped in. When others doubted, I decided. When others broke down, I stayed upright. People praised me for it. They said I was strong, capable, dependable. What they didn't see was how deeply I tied my worth to those words. I didn't learn how to exist without being useful. I learned how to survive by being necessary. Back then, I never worried about being alone. Even when I was physically alone, I knew someone would call. Someone would need something. That knowledge filled the silence. It made the quiet bearable. I remember moments that seem small now, but meant everything then. Standing in a room full of people and knowing my presence changed the outcome. Watching others wait for my reaction before they spoke. Feeling the shift when I entered a space. Not dominance, relevance. And relevance is addictive. You don't crave attention. You crave impact. You crave knowing that if you weren't there, things would be harder. I didn't chase power. I chased usefulness. See, because usefulness felt like love. No one ever told me that this kind of value expires. No one warned me that the world doesn't need you forever, even if you've given it everything. I believed experience would protect me. that years of effort would turn into permanence. I thought once you earned your place, it was yours. But places don't belong to people. They belong to moments, and moments pass. I can see it clearly now, but back then, I couldn't imagine being replaced. Not because I thought I was irreplaceable, but because I thought I was integrated, like part of the structure. You don't replace beams, you don't replace foundations. Or so I believed. I didn't notice the first crack. It was subtle. Someone handled something without telling me. A decision made quickly, without my input. I felt a flicker of surprise, but brushed it off. They've learned, I told myself. That's good. I didn't realize learning meant independence, and independence means separation. At the time, I was proud. Proud that others didn't need me as much. I thought this meant I had done my job well. I thought this was success. I didn't understand the cost, because when people no longer need you, they don't announce it. They don't gather you in a room and thank you. They simply move on, quietly. And if your identity is built on being essential, that silence becomes unbearable. I started remembering my past more often than I should have, replaying moments when my opinion mattered, when my presence carried weight, not out of arrogance, out of longing. I missed the certainty. I missed knowing exactly where I stood. Back then, I knew my role. I knew my purpose. Now, those memories feel like stories about someone else. Someone stronger, someone clearer, someone who belonged. I don't regret those years, but I do regret how completely I let them define me. Because when the world stopped asking, I didn't know who I was, without the answers. I didn't know how to sit still without being summoned. I didn't know how to speak without being invited. The past didn't just give me pride. It gave me a standard that my present could never meet, and every quiet moment now feels like a comparison I can't win. I used to be needed. That fact shaped everything, and losing it wasn't just losing a role. It was losing myself, piece by piece, without anyone noticing. That's the part no one tells you. When you've been important for a long time, becoming unimportant doesn't feel like change. It feels like erasure. And once you've tasted relevance, irrelevance cuts deeper than failure ever could. Because failure still means you mattered enough to fall. This feels like never being counted again. And I wasn't ready for what that would do to me. It took me a long time to understand this. My problem was never aging. It was attachment. I didn't just like being useful. I needed it. Usefulness became the language I used to understand my own worth. If I helped, I mattered. If I solved problems, I existed. If I carried weight, I belonged. And when those things slowly disappeared, so did my sense of self. At first, I didn't notice how tightly everything was connected. I told myself I was just adapting, just stepping back, just letting others grow. That's what mature people do, right? They make space. They don't cling. They don't insist. But inside, something else was happening. Every time I wasn't asked, I felt smaller. Every time someone handled things without me, I felt lighter. Not relieved, reduced. I began measuring my days differently, not by what I felt, not by what I wanted, but by whether anyone needed me. Some days, no one did, and those days felt endless. I tried to fill the silence. I looked for tasks, for problems, for ways to insert myself without asking, not because I wanted control, but because usefulness was the only proof I knew how to give. Without it, I felt exposed. like a person without credentials. Without justification, I started saying yes to things I didn't care about, helping with things that weren't important, offering opinions where they weren't required. Each time, I hoped someone would say, "Thank you. We couldn't do this without you." Sometimes they did, and for a moment, the emptiness faded. But it always came back, stronger, because the relief never lasted. It was never enough. I realized then that usefulness doesn't age well. It demands more over time, more effort, more relevance, more proof. And the older you get, the harder it is to keep up. The world doesn't slow down to honor your experience. It speeds up. It replaces depth with efficiency, wisdom with speed, patience with output. And slowly, quietly, the things you're good at stop being what's needed. I watched this happen in real time, not with anger, with disbelief. I kept thinking, they'll see, they'll realize, they'll come back. But they didn't. Nigh because from their perspective, nothing was missing. That was the hardest part to accept. My absence didn't create chaos. It created continuity. Life went on. Decisions were made. Problems were solved. Laughter continued. And the world did not pause to notice that I was no longer central to it. That realization changed the way I saw myself. I stopped seeing a person. I started seeing a function. And once a function becomes obsolete, it doesn't argue. It just disappears. I didn't know how to be present without being productive. I didn't know how to sit in a room and just exist. I felt guilty resting, guilty being quiet, guilty doing nothing, because doing nothing felt like proof that I no longer mattered. I judged myself more harshly than anyone else ever did. Every quiet day became an accusation. What did you contribute today? What were you good for? Why were you even here? No one asked me these questions. I asked them myself, over and over, and the answers kept getting quieter. I noticed how my posture changed, how I spoke less, how I waited longer before talking. I started doubting thoughts I used to express without hesitation, not because they were wrong, but because I wasn't sure anyone cared. And when you start censoring yourself like that, you begin to shrink from the inside. I didn't feel old. I felt irrelevant. And irrelevance doesn't announce itself. It seeps in. It shows up as hesitation, as silence, as the habit of stepping back before anyone asks you to. I told myself I was being respectful, but respect doesn't erase you. Fear does. Fear of being unnecessary, fear of being ignored. See, fear of being tolerated instead of valued. I caught myself watching others closely, the way they spoke, the way they moved, the way they took up space. They didn't ask permission. They didn't worry about usefulness. They just were. And I realized how far I'd drifted from that. I had turned my existence into a transaction. If I give something, I earn space. If I stop giving, I disappear. That belief shaped everything. It controlled how I spoke, how I showed up, how I rested. It made me anxious in moments of calm, because calm meant nothing was required of me. And when nothing is required of you, you start wondering why you're there at all. I began to understand something uncomfortable. My usefulness had become a cage. It gave me purpose, but it also limited me. It told me I was only as valuable as my ability to serve. And once that ability faded, so did my sense of worth. I didn't know how to untangle myself from that belief. I didn't know how to feel valuable without being needed. So I clung to the past, to memories of relevance, of impact, of being counted. But memories don't carry weight in the present. They don't open doors. They don't give you a place to stand. They just remind you of what you no longer are. That's when the sadness deepened. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that sits with you when no one is watching, the kind that doesn't cry, but aches. I realized something then, something that scared me more than aging ever could. If my value depends entirely on being useful, what happens when I can't be? Who am I when there's nothing left to offer? That question stayed with me. It followed me into empty rooms, into silent mornings, into nights where sleep came late. And I knew, deep down, that I was standing at the edge of something darker. Because once usefulness becomes your identity, losing it doesn't just change your role, it threatens your existence. And I wasn't ready to face what came next. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It grows. It fills the spaces between conversations, between glances, between moments where you used to matter. At first, I thought silence meant peace. No conflict, no pressure, no demands. But silence changes when it lasts too long. It stops being restful. It becomes accusatory. It asks questions you can't answer. Why aren't you needed? Why aren't you missed? Why is no one looking for you? I started noticing how quiet my days had become. Not calm, empty. Mornings stretched longer. Evenings felt heavier. There were fewer interruptions, fewer calls, fewer reasons to rush. From the outside, it looked like I finally had time. But time without purpose feels different. It feels thick, unmoving. I sat in rooms where conversations happened around me. Not with me. I was included, but not involved. Present, but not necessary. I nodded more than I spoke, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to slow things down. I didn't want to be the reason someone had to explain, or repeat, or wait. Waiting used to be for me. Now I was the one trying not to be waited on. I watched how easily people adapted. They filled the spaces I used to occupy without effort, not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. The world prefers what moves smoothly. And I had become friction, not because I argued, not because I resisted, but because I existed without a function. I began to withdraw without deciding to. I arrived later, left earlier, spoke less. I told myself I was being considerate, but deep down, I was shrinking. I was making myself smaller so my absence would feel natural, so no one would have to adjust. I didn't want anyone to feel the gap I left, because if they didn't feel it, then maybe it meant I hadn't lost anything important. That logic didn't protect me. It hollowed me out. Silence followed me home. It sat beside me at night. It waited with me in the morning. I turned on noise just to avoid it. Music, television, anything to prove the world was still moving. But noise doesn't replace meaning. It just covers the ache. I stopped talking about how I felt. Not because I didn't trust anyone, but because I didn't know how to explain something so quiet. How do you say, "I feel invisible," when no one has actively ignored you? How do you explain pain that comes from being unnecessary, not unloved? People understand loss. They understand conflict. They understand endings. They don't understand fading. Fading looks like stability. So I stayed quiet. I learned to swallow thoughts before they reached my mouth. I watched conversations move forward without my input, and each time, something inside me learned a new habit. Stay still. Stay silent. Don't interfere. That habit spread. I hesitated before speaking, even when I had something worth saying. I questioned my relevance before I questioned my words. And slowly, my voice became unfamiliar to me. I didn't argue anymore, not because I agreed, but because disagreement requires confidence, and confidence requires a sense of place. I wasn't sure where I stood, so I stood nowhere. I noticed how often I apologized for existing, for asking, for taking time. I apologized for silence, and then apologized for speaking. Nothing felt correct. I was constantly adjusting, trying to fit into a space that no longer had a clear shape. The hardest moments weren't dramatic. They were small. Someone making a decision and informing me afterward. Plans happening without my awareness. Conversations pausing awkwardly when I walked into a room, then resuming without addressing me. No hostility, no rejection, just continuation. I felt like a background object, always there, rarely noticed. And backgrounds don't get acknowledged, they just support the scene. And I started questioning my memories. Was I ever as important as I thought? Did I exaggerate my past relevance? Or was I simply unwilling to accept how replaceable I was? That doubt was corrosive. It ate away at my confidence, my certainty, my history. I rewrote my own story to make sense of the present. Maybe I wasn't that valuable. Maybe I just imagined it. Maybe this is what I deserved. Silence has a way of convincing you that you're the problem. It gives you too much time to turn inward, too much space to blame yourself. I felt myself becoming cautious, careful not to be a burden, careful not to need anything, careful not to take up room. Need felt dangerous, because needing meant asking, and asking risked reminding everyone that I no longer had a reason to be there. So I learned to need quietly, to hurt privately, to carry my fear without making it visible. That kind of isolation doesn't scream. It settles. It becomes routine. You wake up. You function. You go through motions. And all the while, something essential goes unacknowledged. I wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. I wasn't abandoned. I was overlooked. And being overlooked hurts in a way that's difficult to describe, because it suggests you were never essential to begin with. I remember sitting alone one evening, not sad, not angry, just numb, and realizing something terrifying. If I disappeared, it wouldn't cause disruption. It would cause adjustment. And adjustment happens quickly. That thought stayed with me. It replayed itself in quiet moments. I imagined the world continuing without pause. Schedules intact, laughter unchanged, life uninterrupted. And I wondered when my presence stopped being a factor. I didn't feel hatred toward anyone. I felt grief. Grief for a version of myself that once had weight. Grief for a time when silence meant rest, not erasure. I tried to tell myself this was normal, that everyone goes through this, that it's part of aging, part of transition, part of letting go. But understanding doesn't cancel pain, it just gives it language. And even with language, the silence kept growing. It filled me. It shaped how I moved through the world. And deep inside, I sensed that this wasn't the end of it. Because silence doesn't just make you disappear. It prepares you for the moment when you try desperately to prove you're still here. There is a moment in life when you realize something has quietly ended, not with noise, not with anger, not even with sadness at first. It ends with silence. It ends when you stop being necessary. I didn't notice it all at once. It happened slowly, so slowly that I thought nothing was wrong. I was still waking up every morning, still sitting at the same table, still living in the same house, still surrounded by people, but something inside me was already gone. I used to be the one everyone turned to for advice, for decisions, for reassurance. People needed my voice, my judgment, my presence, and I built my entire identity around that. Being useful, being relied on, being needed. I didn't realize how dangerous that was, because when your worth depends on being needed, the moment people no longer need you, you begin to disappear. No one warned me about that stage of life. They talk about aging. They talk about retirement. They talk about children growing up. But no one talks about becoming optional. My children didn't stop loving me. That's the cruel part. They just stopped needing me. They learned how to solve problems without calling. They learned how to make decisions without asking. They learned how to live without my guidance. And that is supposed to be a success. That is what every parent works toward. But no one tells you how empty success can feel. I remember the days when my phone never stopped ringing, when my opinion mattered, when my absence was noticed. Now days can pass without anyone asking how I'm doing. Not because they don't care, but because they assume I'm fine. I became the person people assume will always be okay. And that assumption slowly crushed me. At home, I started feeling like a shadow. I was there, but not essential. Conversations continued without me. Plans were made without my input. If I spoke, people listened politely, but they didn't wait for my words anymore. I wasn't ignored. I was tolerated. And that hurts more, because being ignored can be confronted, but being unnecessary feels final. I started questioning my value. Not in dramatic ways, in quiet, private moments. Late at night, early in the morning, when no one else was watching. I asked myself questions I was afraid to answer. If I disappeared, would anyone struggle? If I stopped showing up, would anything fall apart? And the honest answers terrified me. Life would continue, smoothly, efficiently, without interruption. That realization doesn't come with tears at first. It comes with numbness. You feel hollow, like a room that used to be full, so now emptied without anyone noticing. I tried to stay busy, to fill the time, to stay relevant. But deep down, I knew I wasn't fighting boredom. I was fighting invisibility. The world no longer asked anything from me. And without being asked, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had spent decades proving my worth through responsibility, through sacrifice, through showing up when others needed me. And suddenly, there was no role left to play. That's when loneliness truly begins. Not when you're alone, but when you realize your presence no longer matters. I would sit in the same room as my family and feel completely separate from them. They laughed, they talked, they planned, and I watched. Not because I wasn't invited, but because no one noticed whether I joined or not. I started shrinking myself, talking less, so offering fewer opinions, as if preparing myself for disappearance. Because if no one needs you, you start wondering whether you deserve space at all. The hardest part is not losing relevance, it's losing purpose. Waking up without being needed feels heavier than any physical burden. Because purpose gives structure to suffering. Without it, pain becomes meaningless. I don't blame anyone. That's important to say. This isn't their fault. This is life. This is time. This is the natural order of things. But understanding that doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes the pain quieter. And quiet pain lasts longer. I've learned something difficult through all of this, something no one teaches you. You must learn how to exist without being needed. You must learn how to find worth that does not depend on usefulness. And that is terrifying because it means facing yourself without roles, without titles, without responsibilities to hide behind, just you. And the silence. Some days I manage it, some days I don't. Some days I accept that this stage of life is not punishment, but transition. Other days it feels like erasure. If you're listening to this and feeling the same quiet ache, know this. You are not broken. You are not useless. You are not invisible. You are simply standing in a chapter that no one prepared you for. And if this story made you feel seen, if it touched something you rarely speak about, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not because I need you, but because none of us should walk through this silence alone. Eventually, you stop asking the question, not because it was answered, but because asking it hurts too much. You stop wondering if anyone needs you. You stop checking your phone. You stop expecting your name to be called, not out of peace, out of exhaustion. There is a strange stage of life where hope doesn't break you anymore. Expectation does. So you learn to expect nothing. That's how survival begins. I didn't become bitter overnight. I became quiet. I became careful. I learned how to take up less space. I learned how to exist without disturbing anyone's rhythm. Because once you realize you are no longer needed, you become afraid of being in the way. I stopped offering help, not because I couldn't, but because no one asked. I stopped sharing thoughts, not because I had none, but because silence felt safer than indifference. There is a dignity in stepping back. But there is also a grief no one talks about. You grieve the version of yourself that mattered, the version that had a function, a reason, a place. And when that version fades, you're left with time. Too much time. Time to remember. Time to regret. Time to replay moments you once rushed through. I started revisiting old memories. Not the dramatic ones. The ordinary ones. Driving my children to school. Solving problems that felt important at the time. Being tired but necessary. Back then, I complained. I felt overwhelmed. I thought responsibility was a burden. I didn't know it was a privilege. Now the days are lighter, and that is the heaviest part. No one depends on me. No one waits for me. No one builds their plans around my presence. Freedom, they call it. But freedom without purpose feels like floating without direction. I tried to redefine myself. I really did. I told myself that life isn't about being needed, that worth doesn't come from usefulness, that this is a chance to finally live for myself. And some days, I almost believe that. But late at night, when the world is quiet, the truth comes back. I don't miss being busy. I miss being essential. I don't miss the pressure. I miss the meaning. People say, "You've done enough." They say, "It's your time now." But they don't tell you how empty your time can feel when no one shares it with you. I realized something uncomfortable. Most of my identity was borrowed. Borrowed from roles. Borrowed from expectations. Borrowed from being needed. And now that those roles are gone, I am left to meet myself for the first time. Not the strong one. Not the provider. Not the decision maker. So just a person, aging, quiet, still here. There is no applause for this stage of life, no milestones, no recognition. You simply continue breathing in a world that no longer requires your contribution. And that requires a different kind of strength, a quiet strength, an unseen endurance. Some days I accept it. I wake up, I make my coffee, I sit with the silence, and I don't fight it. Other days, the silence feels like an accusation, as if life is asking, "What are you still doing here?" I don't have a clean answer to that. All I know is this: being alive without being needed forces you to confront existence in its rawest form. No applause, no validation, no role to hide behind. Just you and the passing of time. And maybe that is the final lesson: not to be useful, not to be needed, but to exist without permission, to stay. Even when no one is watching, even when no one is waiting. That is not a hopeful ending, but it is an honest one. If this story stayed with you, if it felt uncomfortably familiar, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not for motivation, not for solutions, but for stories that speak the truths we rarely say out loud.